Ada knelt in the cold mud at the edge of the woods, the pre-dawn light barely piercing the thick mist. Her breath hitched, a sharp sound in the stillness. It wasn't fear that tightened her chest. It was a cold, pure rage that started in her gut and spread like ice through her veins. Before her, the small family plot was violated. The two handmade stone markers, worn smooth by decades of rain and neglect, had been dug up. The earth was freshly turned, dark and wet against the pale grass, and placed neatly on the disturbed soil, as if in offering, lay a tarnished sheriff's star. Its points were dull, but it gleamed with a malicious intent. "No," she whispered, the word a puff of steam in the chill air. Her dog, a grizzled hound named Jed, let out a low growl, his hackles raised as he stared back toward the darkened shape of the house. The rumble of an engine cut through the silence. Headlights swept across the field, painting the mist in brief ghostly stripes. A truck pulled up, its engine dying with a cough. Sheriff John Coyne stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He was a man carved from the same old wood as the county, his face lined with the weight of inherited power. "Ada, heard there was a fuss," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at the graves. His eyes were fixed on her, weighing her reaction. Ada didn't stand. She remained kneeling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You hearing things now, John? Or you seeing them?" she asked, her voice flat and hard. Sheriff Coyne tipped his hat back slightly. "Some kids, probably. Drunk. I'll have a word around town," he said, dismissing the scene with a wave of his hand. "Kids don't carry these," Ada said, her voice gaining an edge. She pointed a trembling finger at the badge. "Not anymore. That's old. Belonged to my grandfather. Probably stolen from the Historical Society," he replied, his tone casual, but his eyes narrowed just a fraction. Ada pushed herself to her feet, her knees protesting. The mud clung to her jeans. "It's a message for me. You know what it means." The sheriff's posture shifted. The official ease dropped away and his voice lowered, becoming something more personal, more dangerous. "Your grandmother had a rule, Ada, a smart rule. We don't speak of the twins." He gestured at the dug-up earth, the overturned stones. This is what happens when you start talking." "I haven't said a word," Ada shot back, her gaze unwavering. "Haven't you?" He took a step closer, and Jed's growl deepened. "Your daughter's been asking questions in town, at the library, in the records. Silence kept this land safe. Your girl's digging up more than bones." He let the words hang in the air between them, a clear accusation. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. The door slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and the headlights swept away, leaving her in the gradual grey light of morning. Ada stood there, alone with the disturbed earth and the silent, accusing gleam of the star. The wind picked up, whispering through the pines, carrying the scent of wet soil and decay. She looked down at the badges, then toward the woods, where the secrets were buried deep. The rule had been broken, not by her words, but by this act. The silence had been shattered, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, that the trouble was only beginning. She knelt again, not in prayer, but in defiance, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the star. It felt like a threat and a promise all at once. The past was awake, and it was hungry. The grumble of Cora's aging sedan was a foreign sound against the familiar quiet of the homestead, its engine coughing to a stop where the sheriff's truck had been just hours before. The door creaked open and she stepped out, her movements stiff from the long drive. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a scent that immediately closed in around her, both comforting and suffocating. She hauled a single suitcase from the passenger seat, its weight a dull testament to a life in the city that had somehow evaporated. The house stood before her, a stubborn silhouette against the grey sky, its paint peeling but its bones unbent. And on the porch, silhouetted in the dim light from the open door, stood her mother. Ada didn't move to help. She just watched, her arms crossed over her chest, a figure carved from the same weathered wood as the porch rails. "City didn't stick," Ada said, her voice carrying across the yard, flat and final. Cora slammed the car door shut, the sound unnaturally loud. "It stuck me with bills I can't pay." She hefted the suitcase and started toward the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Felt like a pull to come back." Ada's eyes were dark pools in the shadows. "A pull or a push." Cora reached the steps and paused, looking up at her mother. There was no embrace, no smile of welcome. There was just the space between them, charged with years of silence. She followed Ada inside, the screen door snapping shut behind them, with a sound like a trap closing. The inside of the house was a museum of quiet grief. It was colder than outside, the air stale and motionless. Dust lay thick on the arms of two specific chairs that no one ever sat in. By the door, Two empty hooks stood out against the faded wallpaper, positioned too low for adult coats. A silent question that had never been answered. Cora dropped her suitcase by the door. I had dreams again, Mom. Bad ones. About the well. Ada moved to the wood stove, slamming the kettle onto its surface with more force than necessary. Dreams are just dreams. Are they? Cora's voice was sharp, frayed at the edges. Why did you really call me back? You said it was urgent. You said, it's starting again. Ada kept her back turned, her shoulders tense. The old plot. Someone dug it up last night. Cora went perfectly still. The only sound was the faint hiss of the kettle beginning to warm. The air in the room felt thin, sucked out by the words. The twins' graves, she whispered, the name feeling forbidden on her tongue. Ada whirled around, her face a mask of sudden anger. We don't call them that. What do we call them then? Cora shot back, her own frustration boiling over. The quiet ones, the ones we don't mention. They have names, Mom. I found them in the county archive. Elias and Isaiah. The color drained from Ada's face. She took a step forward, her hand gripping the edge of the table. You did what? I told you to leave it be. That digging, that's what caused this. Her voice was low and venomous. Caused what? Cora demanded, stepping closer, the space between them now crackling with confrontation. Tell me. What happened to them? Why is the whole town so afraid of a story that's 100 years old? It's not the story they're afraid of, Ada said, her words dropping to a harsh whisper. She leaned in, her eyes locked on Cora's. It's the consequence, and you've just invited it right to our door. The kettle began to whistle, a shrill, screaming sound that neither woman moved to stop. It filled the kitchen, a desperate noise that underscored the silence that had finally been broken. Cora looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw not just anger, but a deep, old fear that had been nursed for a lifetime. This wasn't a homecoming. It was a summons to a fight she didn't yet understand, and the ground beneath her feet felt less solid than it had a moment before. The whistle died abruptly as Ada yanked the kettle from the stove, the silence that returned feeling heavier and more dangerous than before. The attic air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten things. A single bare bulb hung from a wire, swinging slightly and casting long, dancing shadows. Cora knelt on the rough planks, her hands covered in a fine layer of grime. She'd rolled back the faded rug, its pattern lost to time, and her fingers found the familiar looseness of a floorboard her mother had shown her once, a lifetime ago, in a moment of rare trust. She worked it free, the wood groaning in protest. Beneath it lay a metal box, rusted at the corners. It felt cold and heavy in her hands. She lifted the lid, the hinge screeching into the silence. Inside, wrapped in brittle oilcloth, was a leather-bound ledger. The cover was stained, the leather cracked. She opened it carefully. The pages were thin as onion skin. The ink faded to a rusty brown. Her voice was a flat, disbelieving whisper in the dusty quiet. Year 1897, debt to coin mining for land rights, unpaid. Debt to the county for taxes, unpaid. Offer made. One son, Elias, to work the coin mine to settle family debt. Offer accepted. She turned the page, the paper crackling under her touch. The next entry was shorter, colder. Her blood ran cold as she read it aloud, the words sticking in her throat. 3 months later, Elias lost in a mine collapse. Coin forgives remaining debt in exchange for second son, Isaiah, a mercy to keep the family on the land. She flipped faster now, through empty pages, through years of silence recorded in blank spaces. Then on the final page, in a different, frantic script that slashed across the paper, were 2 words. She whispered them, her voice barely audible. We refused. The attic door creaked open behind her. Cora didn't jump. She just closed the ledger slowly, holding it against her chest like a shield. Ada stood on the top step, not angry as she had been in the kitchen, but defeated. Her shoulders slumped, all the fight gone out of her. She looked old in the weak light. You found it, Ada said, her voice hollow. Cora stood up, the ledger heavy in her hands. They sold him. After the first one died, they tried to sell the other. Our family. Ada shook her head slowly, her eyes distant. It wasn't a sale, it was a sacrifice. To survive. She took a step into the attic, her gaze fixed on the ledger. My great-grandmother. She's the one who wrote, we refused. She hid Isaiah. The coins came for him. There was a fight at the well. What happened? Cora asked, the question hanging in the dusty air between them. Ada's eyes met hers, filled with a century of grief. The well has been dry ever since, and the silence began. She turned and walked back down the stairs, leaving Cora alone with the weight of the book and the terrible truth it contained. The silence wasn't just a rule, it was a tombstone for a crime, and the well wasn't just dry. It was a grave. The past wasn't a story anymore. It was a chain, and she now felt its cold links tightening around her own wrists. The sleep sleek black car purred to a stop beside Cora's rusted sedan, its polished surface reflecting the grim facade of the house like a distorted mirror. The engine cut out, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Governor Coyne stepped out, his suit sharp and out of place against the dusty yard. He moved with an easy confidence, a smile already fixed on his face as he approached the porch where Ada stood waiting, her arms crossed. Cora watched from the doorway, feeling the air tighten. He knocked once, a polite tap, though the door was already open. Ada didn't invite him in, she simply stepped aside, a silent, stiff permission. He entered, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and his smile widened as he spotted Cora. "Ada, always a pleasure," he said, his voice smooth as oil. His gaze shifted to Cora. "And this must be Cora, the historian. Heard you've been delving into our shared past." His tone was friendly, but his eyes were calculating, missing nothing. Cora didn't move from her spot. "Some histories don't want to stay buried," she replied, her voice flat, matching his false courtesy with blunt truth. He chuckled, a soft, humorless sound. "A wise point. Which is why I'm here, to look forward." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "My new development project. Your land is the final piece. It's a very generous offer." He pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and slid it across the kitchen table. The number on the front page was obscenely large, a figure meant to stun and seduce. Ada didn't look at the paper. Her eyes stayed on his face. "This land is not for sale," she said, each word a stone dropped into still water. The governor's smile didn't falter, but it grew colder. "Everything is for sale, Ada, or it can be taken for back taxes, a legal necessity." He shrugged, a gesture of feigned regret. "Such a shame, but there is another way." He turned his attention fully to Cora, his gaze intent. "A donation of the land to the County Historical Trust. In honor of my family's long guardianship of this region, your family name would be remembered fondly. A clean end to all these ugly old stories." "Get out," Ada said, her voice low and dangerous, all pretense of civility gone. The governor's smile vanished instantly. He stood up straight, his posture shifting from persuasive to threatening. "The offer expires in 48 hours. He looked from Ada to Cora, his eyes lingering on the younger woman. "After that, the silence ends, and the real trouble begins." He took a step toward the door, then paused, turning back for a final blow. "Think of your daughter, Ada. History doesn't have to repeat itself." He walked out, the screen door slapping shut behind him. They watched through the window as he got into his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Cora looked at the contract on the table, then at her mother's rigid back. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. The past was no longer knocking at the door. It had just walked in, sat down, and laid its cards on the table. The invitation wasn't an offer, it was a declaration of war, and the battlefield was their home. Cora stood before the old stone well, its circular wall crumbling in places, the wooden boards covering it rotted through with age and neglect. The governor's visit had left a silence in the house that was louder than any argument, and the ledger's words burned in her mind. She had to know. She grabbed the edge of the heaviest board, her fingers digging into the soft, splintering wood, and pulled. It came away with a groan, releasing a shower of dirt and dead insects. She tossed it aside and worked on the next one, each removal letting more of the damp, cold air from below wash over her face. When the opening was clear, she leaned over the rough stone edge, peering down into the darkness. The story was always that the well had gone dry, but that was a lie. Black, still water reflected the grey sky far above, a dark mirror hiding whatever lay beneath. She picked up a loose stone from the ground and dropped it in. She waited for the splash, but instead there was a dull, heavy thud. It hadn't hit water. It had hit something solid just below the surface. A jolt, like an electric shock, went through her. The world tilted. She wasn't in her own body anymore. She was small, hiding in the tall reeds, their sharp edges scratching her arms. The air was hot and thick with the smell of coming rain. She saw her great-grandmother, Eleanor, not as an old woman in a faded photo, but young and strong, her face set in a fierce desperation. She held a small, crying boy tightly against her chest. A man stood opposite them, his bulk blocking the path back to the house. He wore a sheriff's star on his vest, and his voice was a low, threatening rumble. "Give him over, Eleanor. It's settled. The debt is paid this way. It's for the best." Eleanor shook her head, her voice cracking with emotion. "The best? You call this the best? You got one boy killed. I won't give you the other. The mine collapse was an accident. This is a mercy. The family keeps the land. The boy learns a trade. It's more than you have now. He's my son. He's not a payment." Eleanor clutched the boy tighter. The little boy, Isaiah, wailed, his cries sharp and panicked. The sheriff took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Don't make this difficult. It's done. Stay back, Eleanor warned, her eyes wild. He kept coming. I'm not asking. In a burst of motion that was pure instinct, Eleanor shoved him. It wasn't a graceful push. It was a raw, explosive act of survival. The sheriff's eyes widened in surprise as he lost his balance on the muddy ground. His arms flailed, grabbing at nothing, and then he was gone, tumbling backward into the open mouth of the well. A short, choked cry was cut off by a terrible final splash. The sound echoed for a moment in the sudden quiet. Then, the only noise was Isaiah's terrified screaming. Eleanor stood frozen for a second, staring at the well, her chest heaving. Then she turned to the boy, pulling him close, trying to soothe him. Hush now. Hush, it's all right. It's all right. But her own hands were shaking violently. The boy wouldn't stop screaming, his small body trembling with a fear that would never really leave him. He had seen it all. He was a witness. A terrible resolve settled on Eleanor's face. She looked from the well to the boy, then toward the deep dark woods that bordered their land. She didn't look toward the house. Cora, from her hiding place in the reeds, understood what was happening, even as a child. This wasn't just about hiding a body, it was about hiding a life. Eleanor knelt down, her voice becoming low and urgent. Isaiah, listen to me. You need to be quiet now. Very quiet. We have to go on a trip. A long trip. She didn't kill him. What she did was worse. She took his hand and led him, the still sobbing boy, away from the well, away from the home he knew, and into the shadows of the trees. She was saving him from the coins, from the law, from a life of servitude, but she was also erasing him. To the world, both twins were now dead. The silence that followed wasn't just to cover a murder. It was to protect the one living soul who knew the truth, a boy who would have to become a ghost to survive. The memory released her as suddenly as it had taken hold. Cora stumbled back from the well, gasping for air, her hand pressed against her mouth. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet. The truth was so much heavier than she had imagined. It wasn't just a story of a crime hidden. It was a story of a sacrifice so profound it had fractured a family for generations. A matriarch had chosen a path of terrible silence, not out of shame, but out of a fierce, desperate love. She had condemned herself and her descendants to a life of whispers and fear to protect a child. The well wasn't just a grave for a corrupt sheriff. It was a monument to that impossible choice. Cora looked at the dark water again, and now she saw not just water, but the weight of that secret, the depth of that loss. The silence had lasted for generations because it was built on a foundation of love and violence. And now she was the one who had to decide what to do with it. The past had reached up out of the well and grabbed her, and it wouldn't let go. Cora burst into the kitchen, the door hitting the wall with a sharp crack. Her face was pale, her hands shaking so badly she had to clutch the doorframe to steady herself. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Ada turned from the stove, her eyes narrowing at the disturbance, but then widening as she took in her daughter's state. The kettle began to whistle, a high, frantic sound that Cora hardly heard. I saw it, Cora choked out, the words tumbling over each other. I remember. Great-grandmother Eleanor, she didn't kill the twin. She hid him. She killed the sheriff. He's in the well. The whistle died as Ada pulled the kettle from the heat. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. Ada didn't speak. She walked slowly to the kitchen table and sank into a chair, the wood groaning under her weight. All the defiance, all the sharp edges she always carried seemed to dissolve. She just nodded, a slow, weary motion. Yes, she said, her voice flat. The coins always suspected, but they never knew for sure. They couldn't dig for the body without admitting why. Their power was built on a lie too, so the silence served everyone. She looked up, her eyes meeting Cora's. Until now. The voice came from the doorway. Sheriff Coyne stood there, having entered without a sound. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his gun. The friendly, folksy mask he wore for the public was gone, stripped away to reveal something cold and hard beneath. He didn't look at Ada. His gaze was fixed on Cora, as if she were the source of the trouble. Cora took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ada rose from her chair, her body tense again, but now it was the tension of a cornered animal. My great-granddaddy, the sheriff said, his voice low and even. Governor wants that well dug up, wants to build his golf course. He doesn't care what we find, but I do. He took a step into the room. That's my blood in that hole. Ada moved to stand between him and Cora. What do you want, John? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. I want you to sign the papers, he said, his eyes flicking to the contract still lying on the table. Then I'll make sure the ground here is paved over with 6 feet of concrete. Our secret stays buried. You and your girl walk away. Cora found her voice, though it trembled. And if we don't? The sheriff smiled then, a sad, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then I have to arrest you for the murder of my ancestor, a century-old crime. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. And I'll have to tear this whole land apart to find the evidence. evidence. There will be nothing left of your family. Again, he looked around the kitchen, at the worn linoleum and the chipped sink, as if already measuring it for destruction. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. The sound of his truck engine starting was a growl of finality. Cora looked at her mother, at the stark fear on her face that she had never seen before. The truth was out, but instead of setting them free, it had become a weapon in the hands of their enemy. The well held a body, but the house now held a new kind of ghost, the certainty of what was to come. Cora burst into the kitchen, the screen door slamming behind her with a crack that echoed through the quiet house. Her face was ghostly pale, her hands trembling uncontrollably at her sides. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Ada turned from the sink, her eyes initially sharp with annoyance, then widening with alarm at the sight of her daughter. "I saw it," Cora gasped, the words fighting their way out. "I remember great-grandmother Eleanor. She didn't kill the twin. She hid him. She killed the sheriff. He's in the well." Ada didn't speak. She walked slowly to the kitchen table, her movements heavy, and sank into a chair. The fierce resistance that always defined her seemed to drain away, leaving behind a weary emptiness. She simply nodded, a slow, conceding gesture. "Yes," she said, her voice hollow. The coins always suspected, but they never knew for sure. They couldn't dig for the body without admitting why. Their power was built on a lie too, so the silence served everyone. She looked up, her gaze meeting Cora's. Until now. The voice came from the doorway. Sheriff Coyne stood there, his bulk filling the frame. He had entered without a sound. His hand rested on the polished grip of his holstered gun. All pretense of the friendly neighbor was gone, replaced by a cold, flat authority. He focused on Cora, his eyes hard. "My great-granddaddy," he said, the words dropping like stones. "Governor wants that well dug up, wants to build his golf course. He doesn't care what we find, but I do." He took a single step into the room. "That's my blood in that hole." Ada pushed herself up from the chair, placing herself between the sheriff and her daughter. "What do you want, John?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "I want you to sign the papers," he said, nodding toward the governor's contract still on the table. "Then I'll make sure the ground here is paved over with 6 feet of concrete. Our secret stays buried. You and your girl walk away." Cora found her voice, though it wavered. "And if we don't?" The sheriff offered a thin, sorrowful smile that held no warmth. "Then I have to arrest you for the murder of my ancestor, a century-old crime." He let the threat hang in the air, its implications settling over the room. "And I'll have to tear this whole land apart to find the evidence. There will be nothing left of your family." Again, he didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, the sound of his boots on the porch boards fading, until his truck engine roared to life and rumbled away. Cora looked at her mother, at the stark fear etched on her face, a look she had never seen before. The truth had been spoken aloud, and in the doing, it had become a trap. The well held a body, but the house now held the crushing certainty of what was to come. Ada stood before the cold fireplace, her gaze fixed on the ashes of last night's fire. The governor's contract lay on the rough wooden mantelpiece, a crisp white rectangle against the dark, stained wood. The house was silent except for the sound of Cora's anxious breathing behind her. The sheriff's visit had left a chill that the weak morning sun couldn't warm. "He's right," Ada said, her voice low and flat. "They always win. They have the law. They have the guns. They have the memory of our fear." Cora stepped closer, her arms wrapped around herself. "So we run?" she asked, the words sounding small and hopeless in the quiet room. Ada turned, her eyes clear and hard. "No, we change the story. We break the silence, but on our terms." She reached for the contract, picking it up between her thumb and forefinger as if it was something filthy. She held it over the cold grate, then struck a match against the hearth. The flame flared, and she touched it to the corner of the paper. It caught quickly, the fire eating hungrily toward her fingers. She let it burn for a moment longer before dropping it into the ashes. "The power isn't in hiding the body," she said, watching the pages curl into black flakes. "It's in revealing it to everyone all at once." "They'll destroy you," Cora whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the contract turn to smoke. "They'll try," Ada agreed, turning to face her daughter fully. "But you'll be gone. With the truth, the ledger, your story," she pointed toward the attic. "You'll take it to the state paper, the real one, not the one the governor owns." Cora understood then. This wasn't a surrender. It was a tactical retreat, a diversion on a grand scale. Her mother was drawing all the attention to herself, creating a spectacle that would give Cora a chance to slip away. "Mom," she started, but Ada cut her off. "A matriarch's job is to protect the line," Ada said, her voice gaining a fierce, unshakable strength. She placed her hands on Cora's shoulders, her grip firm. Eleanor did it with violence and silence. I'm doing it with fire and truth. She looked deep into her daughter's eyes, ensuring the message was received, understood, and branded into her soul. You are the line, Cora. You have to be the one who speaks. The words were not a request. They were an passing of a torch, an inheritance more valuable than land. The final ember of the contract glowed orange in the dark grate, and in its dying light, Cora saw not an ending, but a brutal, necessary beginning. Her mother's choice was made. The silence would be broken by an explosion, and Cora's job was to make sure the world heard the truth in the blast. The tires of Cora's car screamed against the asphalt as she sped down the dark, winding road away from the homestead. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the old ledger and a folder of notes shoved roughly into the bag on the passenger seat. In the rearview mirror, a tiny orange glow began to bloom against the black sky, a single defiant star on the horizon that quickly grew brighter. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the road ahead, on the truth she now carried. Back at the farm, the air was thick with the sharp, chemical smell of kerosene. Ada stood calmly between the old house and the stone well, an empty canister at her feet. Sheriff Coyne, Governor Coyne, and two other men stood by their vehicles, their faces illuminated by the headlights, etched with confusion and a dawning unease. The governor took a step forward, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Burning it down? Saving us the trouble, Ada? A final act of spite? He called out, his voice echoing in the unnatural quiet. Ada turned to face them, and in the harsh light, she was smiling. It was a terrible, serene smile. Not spite, she replied, her voice carrying clearly. An excavation. You wanted to see what was in the well? Now the whole world will see. The fire department, the news helicopters, they'll all come, and they'll find a skeleton with a tarnished star. The sheriff's hand went to his gun. You're insane. You'll die here, he snarled, taking a step toward her. Maybe, Ada said, her gaze unwavering. But my daughter is gone, and she's not coming back empty-handed. Your story ends tonight. The Coyne legacy, built on a child's bones, and a murder in a well. The governor's smirk vanished. His eyes darted from Ada to the well, then to the growing glow beginning to lick at the base of the old house. Realization dawned on his face, cold and sickening. This had never been about hiding the secret from them. It was about forcing them to be present at its unearthing, making them witnesses to the destruction of their own myth. They were trapped by their own greed, standing on the very ground that would become their disgrace. The silence is over, Ada said, her voice final. She struck a match against the sole of her boot. The small flame flared, illuminating her determined face for a moment before she dropped it. There was a loud whoosh as the kerosene-soaked ground ignited, the fire racing along the paths she had laid, a river of light and heat rushing toward the well and the house, engulfing the past and lighting the way for the future in a single roaring conflagration. The television screen flickered to life in a dozen anonymous motel rooms and 1,000 living rooms, revealing a stark studio set. Cora sat in a simple chair, her hands folded on a glass table. The family ledger lay before her, its cracked leather binding looking ancient under the bright lights. The interviewer, a woman with a calm, serious demeanor, leaned forward slightly. So, the fire revealed the remains of Sheriff Jeremiah Coyne? She asked, her voice measured. Cora didn't flinch. She looked directly at the woman, her own gaze clear and steady. It did, and it revealed the truth, she said, her voice firm despite the millions listening. My family, the Blackwoods, were victims of debt slavery. Our sons, Elias and Isaiah, were the price for land that was already ours. She paused, letting the names hang in the air for a moment, breaking the silence of a century. Elias died in a coin mine. Isaiah was hidden to save him. The first matriarch, Eleanor, killed to protect her child. And every matriarch since has carried that silence to protect us. The interviewer nodded slowly. And the governor's involvement? His family's role? Cora's eyes shifted from the interviewer to the camera lens, looking straight into the homes of everyone watching. Governor Coyne's fortune was built on my family's grief. His power was maintained by our fear. She picked up the ledger, holding it so the camera could see its weathered cover. This ledger details the transaction. My ancestor's handwriting shows the moment she said no more, but the silence ends with me. She put the book down and placed her palms flat on the table, leaning forward with a quiet intensity that was more powerful than any shout. We speak of the twins. We say their names. Elias, Isaiah. She said the names again, slowly, clearly, giving them weight and dignity. They are not secrets. They are our story. The screen held on her face for a long moment after she finished speaking, the silence of the studio itself becoming part of the statement. Then it cut to black. In that silence, the names echoed. Elias, Isaiah. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations. They were no longer ghosts in a forgotten field. They were a truth that could not be unspoken, a reckoning that would now unfold not in fire, but in the cold light of day. The story was finally told, and nothing would be the same. Cora stood on the blackened earth where the house had once stood. The ruins were gone now, cleared away, leaving only a scar of dark soil. The old well was sealed with a heavy, flat stone, a permanent lid on the past. The air carried the twin scents of cold ash and the rich, damp smell of earth that had been recently turned. A young apple tree sapling, its branches thin and hopeful, stood tied to a stake a few yards away. She knelt by the small, reclaimed family plot, now clearly defined against the scorched ground. In her hands were two smooth riverstones, heavy and grey. With a small chisel, she carefully carved the names into their surfaces, the scratches forming letters in the quiet morning. Elias, Isaiah. She placed the stones side by side at the head of the plot, pressing them firmly into the soil so they would stand straight. The sound of an approaching car made her look up. An old pickup truck rattled to a stop on the road. A woman she recognized but had never spoken to, a neighbor from a few miles down, got out carrying a pie dish covered with a cloth. She walked slowly across the field, her boots careful on the uneven ground. "Heard you were back," the woman said, her voice raspy. She held out the pie. "Thought you could use this." Cora stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. She accepted the warm dish. "Thank you," she said, genuinely surprised. The neighbor's eyes drifted to the two riverstones. She didn't ask what they were. She just nodded slowly, a knowing look in her faded eyes. "My grandmother, she used to talk about them," the woman said, her gaze distant. "Said Isaiah loved apples, said he had a laugh that sounded like bells." She met Cora's eyes, and for a moment a shared understanding passed between them, a thread connecting across the generations. "We weren't supposed to remember, but some of us did." With a final nod, the woman turned and walked back to her truck, leaving Cora alone with the pie and the stones. Cora sat down on the ground, placing the pie beside her. The wind moved through the small grove of new saplings she had planted, making their slender leaves whisper. It was just the wind now, not a haunted sound carrying secrets, but a simple, natural noise. She reached down and picked up a handful of soil. It was black with the ash of what had been lost, but it was also dark and rich, full of the promise of life. She didn't speak to the ghosts. She didn't need to. They were part of the land now, their story told, their memory a part of the roots that would spread deep into this new ground. The silence had lasted for generations, a heavy chain of fear, but it was broken by a matriarch's love. And on the scarred earth, watered by truth and sacrifice, something else had begun to grow.